Welcome, everyone, to the Deep Dive, the podcast that skips small talk and goes straight for the concepts that shape our thinking and behavior. In this podcast, cold expertise is defenestrated as warm philosophy is enthroned in an attempt to explore the field in which we're all scientists looking for answers, living well. Hello, world. Welcome to another episode of the Deep Dive with me, Eyal Shai, and I have Luke Butler on the podcast today. Hi, Luke.
Hello.
Excited
Thank
to
you
have
so much
you.
for having me.
Of course, really happy to have you here and very much looking forward to hearing what we're going to discuss today. Yeah, so I'll let you lead the way and introduce the topic or bundle of topics, however you want to frame it.
What I want to start and talk about today is an idea that I've been playing around with some friends for actually almost a year now that has to do with using metaphors as new ways to build relationships to emotions. And yeah, some of my personal exploration as well as shared exploration with, again, these friends on like the scientific perspective of like, if we scientifically know what emotions are, then we can manage them versus a more poetic or playful relationship to emotions of like, do you need to be told what they are? Do we need some type of knowledge consensus? And is that actually helpful or like distracting or diverting from the path of knowing one's emotions, or what does it even mean to know one's emotions? So yeah, that's where I want to start. And I know we have a few meandering paths I could lead off of, but I think that's probably a healthy enough topic to begin.
Yes, it does sound like that, and it's fascinating. Usually we start at the beginning, as they say, and I just like you to give a little bit of background to understand how and why you approached this subject. So even if you look at your own personal life and go back in time, when is your interest in emotions and in metaphors and at the intersection, or something that's premature still, but where can we find that in your life?
Yeah. So as with many things, it's kind of like when you ask this question, I feel into like, where did this show up before I knew it was there? And then where did it show up consciously? And for me, it started, I was a camp counselor at a summer camp that my mom ran as a teenager. And I feel like there, because the camp had two rules that my mom in all of her wisdom coined, which were be safe and have fun. And while those may sound like generic, somewhat cliche summer camp rules, they actually were very intentionally put forth as, okay, what does safety mean? Not just as physical safety, right? That's a huge one, especially when you're dealing with children, but emotional safety, psychological safety, social safety was something we really prioritized, even if we didn't like articulate it technically as that. It wasn't like there were the bylaws of what be safe means. And have fun, likewise, is deceptively nuanced of, okay, well, how do you make sure everyone is having fun if possible, right? When might you have an activity that isn't fun? And then how do you navigate that? And so working with children, I feel like for me, I really like lived in an ethos of emotional play. And saw the power of it, of just like how young people, and when I say young people, I don't just mean children, but also all the teenage counselors and even the adult staff, like develop relationship with one another. So that would be like the subconscious, where this came into my life before it came into my life. I then studied psychology and neuroscience at university, at Temple University in Philadelphia, in the States. And that gave me some language and framing to what my experience had been. But also then right after that, after I graduated, I went and worked doing like behavioral support for elementary school students. So like 6 to 10 years old, in their school classrooms. And that again was a moment where like I had been to university for 4 years and been learning all these theories and different methods, and like 1 week into that school situation, it was like, okay, wad those up and throw those out and lean on what you learned at the summer camp. Not like, oh yeah, I have a degree in psychology, I'll know what I'm doing. It's like, no, I'm a camp counselor, so I have a bag of tricks and I understand like relationship building with children. And I find that relationship building with adults is just relationship building with children, but like, you know, you kind of have to like find your way into the childlike state, as I know you know. And so from there, when I worked at that school and had the realization of like what I learned in university is not helping an actual human relationship right now, that was about 10 years ago. And so over that 10-year arc, I've worked with young people of different ages, but also kind of stepped off of the academic world. But in part of my 2020, I have so much time on my hands, and how do I keep from, maintain a shred of sanity, was going back into academic literature and getting curious of what are people writing about emotion and cognition and emotional development, how emotion sits in the body, and found a few academics that really excite me, because they're very much like most of what you hear is like inappropriately wrong. And while they may take a little harder science approach, for me, there's the implications of like, what does it mean for us if we've been told, here's what emotions are and emotional intelligence, and how much is that actually keeping us from ourselves and keeping us from, hey, I can choose to explore this like a 6-year-old or like I'm at summer camp. So that's where I think full circle, I started and have landed to where I am today.
That's great. Yeah, the kind of metaphor that comes into my mind, speaking of metaphors, is the fact that, in the old days, I think today the quality of digital music is quite high, but I know that even today there are these connoisseurs of music that say that the digital can never match the analog, because it's still about bits and this kind of binary thing, and somehow they can feel it even when the resolution is quite fine. And I feel that is what is going on with the science, with neuroscience, with emotions, definitely. I mean, things of such complexity that it's really good that science is kind of going into trying and sort things out and make them more discernible by making them into ones and zeros in a way. But we're still so far away from them. And, in the future, who knows, maybe we get to a point where we have such a fine resolution of biology that we're able to kind of make these things simple. But for now, they're absolutely not. And they're so complex. And I feel that's why we have to rely on creativity and playfulness and allowing for a lot of uncertainty. And there maybe I'm kind of getting away from even something very clear to say. But does that resonate with you at all?
It does. And you actually echo some of the like academic researchers that I've been most taken to in the last 18 months, because particularly there's a neuroscientist named Luis Pessoa at the University of Maryland in the States. And he has multiple papers written on how we need to move into a field of complexity science when considering emotion and cognition, and even will fold in attention and perception. And he really puts everything on the table. And what he says is we need to move out of a boxes and arrows like box and arrow diagram metaphor, way of thinking about emotions. And he really, the way he breaks it down is that like Isaac Newton and Newtonian physics, the laws of Newtonian physics can fit pretty easily in box and arrow cause and effect diagrams. And what he says is that like people have been applying this inappropriately to the complexity that is there. And he talks and uses the language of complexity science quite often. And so and one of his core theses is like the entire field, and like as a species our understanding of these things will be well served to move out of the idea that we can encapsulate it and reduce it into cause and effects box and arrow diagrams. So I think that speaks a lot to what you were saying.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this also sits well with Lisa Feldman Barrett's work, because she also is a neuroscientist who's been on several podcasts. And I get my stuff from podcasts, not from academic papers. So I'm not as in a position, as good a position as you are to speak about this. But what I understand from her is that she also recognizes the fact that, despite our categorization of these different emotions, that we think we know what anger is or what sadness is. In fact, if you look at a person, it turns out that, not one of us has really experienced the very same emotion twice in their life. There's just so much nuance there. And, to even try and reduce it to one word is not that. And then when that meets language, I think, then you get into a thing where you internalize maybe it's not right to call myself sad because I'm also a little bit angry at the same time. But when you say that out in language, like I'm sad with a hint of anger, well, that could work. But I think what works even better is to find the poetic way of expressing it, is in a way more accurate, even though it's like poetic, right? Even though it's not. Even though it's not exactly accurate in the sense that we're used to.
I agree very much with, and also definitely appreciate deeply learning from Lisa Feldman Barrett. And her concept, like what you just described, of like we don't feel the same emotions the same way. And then also she talks about emotional understanding as being culturally situated, and that different cultures have different language for different emotions based on cultural understanding, which goes back to like how people are in relationship with each other and their environment. And I think with what you just shared and what we've experienced as we've like played with how do you use metaphor to gain a better understanding of emotion, what we've experienced is exactly that, of like we sometime like an emotion that came up as we were playing was anger, right? And like the play is very simple. It's like choose an emotion, and everyone, if there's half a dozen of us, everyone comes up with their own metaphor of that emotion, and everyone like had picked their own. And then basically it becomes a like, let's tease this out, and like, oh wow, so these metaphors were saying these things. So for example, like when we did anger, one person's anger was like flowing molten lava, right? Like really hot, but felt like it had a slow, cadence to it. And other people's was like angry bees.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about how when like, I know for me, it's like I can connect to both of those two different like states of anger and appreciate that they are very different. Like I have definitely experienced slow burn anger, right? That is like really hot, but also is like moving on a time scale that might be months or years, right? Have also experienced the buzzing, stinging anger of angry bees that are like, there's something present that just takes you from zero to like, ready to attack people.
Right.
And yeah, so with what you were saying, that idea of approaching things poetically, it's like, right, does this give us a like science-based epistemology or phenomenology of what is happening mechanistically? No, but that's not the point. Like, does this give us almost like a Rolodex, or yeah, like a bag of tricks to explore like both our own emotions, and then a lot of relating has happened with that group of people, because now all of a sudden it's like, oh, this is how you experience the world. And goes back to what you said of like, or maybe you didn't say it in these words, but rather than trying to all mutually come up with one working model that we can all fit ourselves into, appreciate that we each have a unique working model of the world, our existence, how we move through those things.
Absolutely. And I think in order to really facilitate each and everyone's understanding of their emotions, I think one thing that should be encouraged is self-expression, right? And being able to express that. So I have a reading recommendation, and it's a short story by Edgar Allan Poe called The Cask of Amontillado, which recently I wrote a short story that's it could be found on my Gumroad account. It pays an homage to that original story. And why I love that story, it's because it's so short, and it explores a certain certain kind of anger, sadism, which again can't be put into words, like vengefulness. And it's really worth reading, because this is exactly it. If you read The Cask of Amontillado, you come out of it with the knowledge of a new emotion, or a new nuanced emotion, which is just fascinating to discover as a human being. And the next time, presumably, when you would feel something like that, which I hope that you don't, and that nobody does, because it seems to be a very hard emotion to deal with. But it's very clear to me that you'd tell yourself, after reading that story, you wouldn't try and tell yourself, oh, I'm vengeful, angry, furious, and all that. But you would say, oh, I'm just like this character in The Cask of Amontillado. Yeah, now you have like the whole story is kind of the epitome of that nuanced state of mind. Is it just emotion? I think it's mood as well. So there's a distinction to be made there, I know. Yeah, and I'm also interested in asking you, like, if you would be willing to share maybe an episode from your life, either before you kind of thought of this explicitly, or after, where you found yourself maybe at first struggling with pinpointing the emotion you're having, and then maybe had a breakthrough or anything of the sort. Do you have an example like that?
Definitely. Yeah, I feel like for me, the one that comes to mind most is the summer camp that I described, that I worked at, that my mom ran, was connected to an elementary school that my mom taught at, and my brother and sister and I went to. And it was on a 31-acre plot of land in suburban Philadelphia. And in 2009, during the whole economic recession, the school was not financially solvent, and they had to sell the property and close, something that had been very, very meaningful in my childhood and upbringing. And when that all took place, yeah, it was lots of big emotions. And it was something where, for me, and just to like identify a couple things here, like at that time I was at university and also was a very, very passionate, rested my identity on being a professional and American college sports fan, which I think is like a really interesting nuance to talk about in relation to emotion and like how people feel their emotions and where your emotions are situated internally versus externally, right? So when that happened, it really, really, it was a deep disruption in my life. And at that time, I was 21, 22 years old. I definitely, being an American college student, resorted to like drinking, partying, avoidance, for a bit of time, and feel the feeling, right? And I would say the shift that took place was a few years after that. I started playing music with my brother and some friends. We formed a band. And like that was like 3 years after, right? And so for like a 3-year period, it was kind of, I was definitely living life almost like, to use a metaphor, like with an albatross, right? Having a weight hung on me that I was not trying to acknowledge as much, like how much it was there, right? And kind of going through life. And for me, it's like when that happens, it's like when a weight presses you down, it's like you still can feel like happiness, sadness, anger, joy, laughter, etc. But it all is like put in this tighter container. And when I started really playing music with my brother, a couple things happened. One, my interest in being a sports fan went way down. And I really connected that to like having creative agency, like being able to create things and be in relationship with people. And during that time, like the struggles in the emotional relationship I had to this disruptive experience also like shifted and moved on. And it's almost like, metaphorically speaking, if you've ever seen a river at the edge of the ocean where like there could be a sandbar, right? And like seasonally there'll be a bar of sand and the river and the ocean are actually disconnected. And then like at some point in the season, the ocean will break through and reconnect them. And that to me almost felt like, and I know I've said a few different threads here, but like when starting to play music and like re-internalizing like my creative capacity, and not just like being creative, but then ultimately being a sports fan and like the highs and lows of emotion being connected to like, how well are the teams doing? That like opened up and allowed to flow through like these held feelings that I wasn't even fully conscious of, or like wasn't letting myself be conscious of like, hey, this has really been impacting you. And like this disruption has kept you from like, emotionally anchoring into seeing where you are now. And it's almost like, people talk about trauma. And I think that like many things warrants a more nuanced conversation. But one of the things about the trauma is it's almost like time travel where you're in two places at once. And for me, it's like my life path was still going, but there was a part of me that was really stuck here. And so like for a few years, it was like I was getting stretched over a period of time. And not that it was like a salve and it happened overnight. And these are still things. It's like once I got into this process, it's like, as long as I'm alive, this will be a part of it. But like when starting to create, when that sandbar broke, then it was like this part of me could kind of like catch up, or I could live it in a different way that allowed me emotionally to, free up from like that burden or weight.
I think that's beautifully put. And the way you just described some really complex emotions and trajectories in your life that have happened. So I'm really happy to hear that. And I think I can also connect it to something in my life, which is dealing with trauma as well, and seeing how being at two places at the same time, or being two places in time at the same time, can happen. I think that when we get traumatized, there are two things. Like obviously the trauma can be of different natures, and I think different traumas make you react differently. In my case, the trauma was just kind of a thing that happens from the universe. My mom died when I was young, and Of course, there was a guy to blame in all of it, in all of this, but we never dwelled on that, on blaming a person, and so you just see it as kind of an act of God, right? So that's very different from having like a concrete perpetrator of what traumatized you. I feel traumas come in different shades as well. But one thing that I think is common to traumas is overwhelm, just sheer overwhelm and facing the fact that something can just happen out of the blue and strike you so hard that you're unable to move forward for a while. And if that kind of kicks you back into some sort of shell and makes you go into that shell, it's going to take a long time to come out of this shell, and it's going to be scary as well. So when I analyze my kind of trajectory after trauma, I definitely see that there were two things. One is sadness, which is totally fitting, you know. Um, so grief, sadness, and then for the longest time, I saw myself as depressed, and I never got quite um, clinically diagnosed with that. But to me, it was depression. Like I did not want to do much. I was very much obsessed with the like ideation of death and suicide and all that. And thankfully, I never really attempted anything. But I think there's no doubt that it would have been interpreted as depression had I gone and sought professional help. Um, what I'm trying to say is that only in retrospect, like maybe some 20 years later, as I was really seeing myself as a healed person, where I don't get triggered by things. I don't have these nights where I wake up and remain with racing thoughts all night about bad things. I see myself as healed, and now only in retrospect I can see that I was overwhelmed for years and years and years, and the only interpretation that was available to me, because due to lack of knowledge and lack of nuanced way of looking at things, I had told myself that I was sad. But really, I was overwhelmed. I think it was past the point where I was just sad. And I think this overwhelm, for example, is something that is common to so many people, and people, according to their inclination and past experiences, may assign an emotion to it and see themselves as the sad person or the angry person. But really, it's overwhelm. So why is that interesting? Because in my case, I felt like the path to healing wasn't to fix some sort of chemistry in my head so I have the happy chemistry. It was inching towards a better understanding of the world and being less afraid of it and being able to get out there and to play again and expose myself to the good and bad that life has to offer, you know. um, so I think that's fascinating, and it also relates to your concept of being stuck at two places, and also how you get to finally resolve these things. And I think in both our cases it takes creativity. Creativity is what I think is the thread that runs through these only two cases, but I dare say that it could be universalized. um, so I'm really interested in that. What do you think of creativity? Obviously, it connects to being poetic, to being um, able to express yourself in new ways, and so on. What is the role of creativity in healing and identifying emotions?
Yeah. So I wanna put a pin in answering that question, like in dialogue, because I really appreciated and connected likewise to the story you just shared, and wanted to use it as a brief like snippet example of like how we've been using metaphor, which also will be creative, and then we'll get back to the
Oh, wonderful.
conversation. But so just very quickly, and we can both do this, take like a minute, and like first comes to mind, no right or wrong, of like metaphorically, how would you describe the overwhelm, and metaphorically that you experienced, and metaphorically, how would you describe sadness? Because you identified these as two different things, but that got lumped as one thing, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, just wondering, like, if you think of any type of metaphor for both of those, and I'll do the same.
Yeah, wow. That's such a good question. I'm being put on the spot. I love it. Um, yeah, I think what I said, being back in your shell, retrieving to some place where it's kind of like you can't be hurt anymore because you've shut yourself off. All the shutters are down, and no sunlight comes in, and it's a kind of purgatory because you're not alive and you're like a walking dead, right? So you're not letting things in that will completely take you out, but you're also in a very real way unable to feel anything and rejoice at feeling it, even if it's a good feeling. So it's not that I wouldn't smile. In fact, I was still a smiley person who would give out smiles, and that's just who I am. So my personality didn't change. But at the first sign of me being able to recognize that I am happy, this would get shut down very quickly and be taken over by this depression, and with it the metaphor of I shouldn't go out there and shouldn't let myself feel like that because, well, I know what happens. For me, age 12 or 13, now I'm thinking that, let's say on average every 10 years something truly horrible happens to you, right? So yeah, I think the metaphor would definitely be something like becoming um, a walking dead person in a dark room that is sick of staying in the room, but is also deathly afraid of stepping outside.
Yeah. You don't have to be as extensive, but if you think about a metaphor for like how you experience sadness, how would you metaphorize sadness?
Yeah. Departure, for sure. Departure, that moment when you say goodbye to someone close, like with me. Obviously, it's very much influenced by actual events in my life. So is it a metaphor or memory? But departure, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. No, that's a beautiful distinction. And just I'll quickly. So for me, when I thought of overwhelm, and I thought your articulation was like something I've very much experienced of like, I've spent a lot of time being overwhelmed, calling it other things. And for me, what I thought about for overwhelm was like, if you were walking across an ice covered lake, but the ice was thin and you went through, and all of a sudden now you're in like freezing water. And even when you get back out, it's like your whole situation has just changed, you know?
Right.
And sadness, I was feeling more of a metaphor of just like a cleansing rainstorm, like just when you get rain and it's like, yeah, you can't see the sun, it's very cloudy, but you also know it's a natural part of things that is going to pass over. And yeah, so I say that, and I feel like there's interesting like parallels to what we said, because like that overwhelmed feeling is like there's a shock, there's a shell, there's a zombification, right? Or like, yeah, there's something that is like you are really taken out of an ordinary state.
Yes.
Where the metaphor of sadness and like sadness as departure, I think, is really beautiful. And especially like you said, is it memory? Is it metaphor? I think the beautiful thing is creatively it can be both, right?
Absolutely.
But that is something that's like more like felt into. So it's almost like, and obviously the movie Inside Out, if you've seen it, like the Pixar movie.
I should rewatch it, but yeah.
Yeah, I think actually I was thinking of having, as part of our metaphoring, like a like shared watching of that movie, like, and maybe a watching and discussion, because I think there's a
Love
lot of
it.
people there who, yeah, that would be just a fun thing to do with people.
For sure.
Um, but yeah, so those metaphors come out as the like, okay, sadness is something that like you can feel into, accept, and like move through a moment, and overwhelm keeps you from that. Um,
Right. And you know what? It makes me reflect on the so I lost my mom just before my 11th birthday, and then I think when I was 20 we had to put down the family dog, which at that point I knew her for longer than I did my mom, you know, which was kind of, we always had black humor in the family, so I would joke about it. But she got very old and, you know, would pee herself and just everywhere and stuff, and her life didn't seem to be a good life. And we took her to the vet, and on the way I got extremely sad. Like, I'm talking about the dog. Well, you know, after I lost my mom, I would have this dog over in my bed, and she was really like providing emotional support for me. And I was super sad, but up until now I had not made the connection that on that day I know I felt extreme sadness seeing her go, but I was with my dad, I was crying, and I told him, you know, I'm so sad, but I'm not afraid. So I had another departure in my life of somebody important to me, maybe not as important, but quite important. And at that point, I was, after years of going into Buddhism, existentialism, just a bunch of isms that kind of helped me frame the world, and got me to a point where I was just starting to crawl out cautiously of this dark room, right? And seeing that the sunlight is there and that you don't get banged on your head as soon as you get out. So I was in that situation where I once again felt the same type of departure in terms of metaphor, but I was telling my dad in real time, like, I'm not afraid. The overwhelm wasn't there because I also internalized at that point that nothing is going to hit me as hard as that first thing. So in a sense, I already gained also the possibility, the knowledge that I can deal with a lot. Um, so yeah, it's an interesting thought that just now came to me.
yeah, and thank you for sharing all of that. And I'm going to use that to meander back into the question that you asked about like the power of creativity and healing, right? Or like in those, what are the relationship between those? If that is roughly the question you asked before, right?
Can you repeat that again?
Oh yeah, just you before I brought up these metaphors,
Mm-hmm.
you asked about like what is the role of creativity in,
Yeah, correct.
yeah. Um and I think the beauty of it is, and like true creativity and play, right? And we've had this conversation before of the like, there is like play, like branded play by people who don't actually understand what that is, versus like really rooting into like a more authentic, if
Mm-hmm.
you know, like wild, unreserved play and creativity. Um, and I think that in like my personal experience, and my primary creative outlet is music and songwriting, and for me it's kind of like you can have these moments like that stuck in two places moment, right? Or that fear in the shell that you described, and then you can have these moments of realization in your life of like, oh, I'm not in this state or stage anymore. um, and then what can also happen is you can now, like what you just described right now, is like reflect, and it's like rather than being in two moments in one time where you feel like stuck and unable to like have a clear view of the present, it is almost like the wisdom that comes with healing and experiencing of like, you can now go back to a moment that previously was very stressful or difficult and actually create and like shift a meaning to it. um and for me, when I think about like songwriting and lyrics and poetry as ways of expressing experience about the world that isn't just like, here is what I experienced and this is what it was, and like I'll give you a very straight prosaic experience of it. But that like I could write a song and it could be deeply meaningful to a very specific moment to me, but that the lyrics are such that like you could hear it and it could be mean something completely different to you, and that's a beautiful thing. But like
Right.
for me, it serves the purpose as like healing vessel of like, oh, this is me making sense of and like unknotting and like sitting in a time that now like allows me to reconnect to it presently, or like in that like unstuck from time state that Vonnegut used. And I think for me, like using that metaphor example as like a creative healing tool or creative tool of inquiry, is it becomes, and this has happened again and again when we've done this, you know, this play with anyone who's shown up, is you have kind of those moments of insight of like, oh, I never connected these emotions in this way, or I never thought of it in this way. And actually now, and I know I've had this personally, of like, it's almost like one of those moments where you look back on your life, but you have a different lens and you're like, oh, I'm looking differently now at things. Or like, this has given me a little, yeah, like a little pearl of insight that allows me to, yeah, play around with, oh, well, here's these moments and they were very difficult. And it's not that they weren't difficult in that moment, but like what you said earlier, like I can be grateful for the difficulty because it's given me lessons and wisdom I otherwise wouldn't have. And give it the opportunity to create with, and not just like create out of needing to heal and process. But like for me, some of the songs, like I've written songs about difficult times in my life, but from a playful perspective, having, yeah, kind of gone through that meaning making, yeah, process. So I don't know, I got a little meandery at the end. Did that all?
No, I think that's wonderful, and it's so important to be able to gain new perspectives on things. It kind of, highlights for me the fact that a lot of people think that philosophy or just doing anything like that is just playing with words, but it's amazing actually how through that you really do change the contents of your consciousness, right? I mean, it seems almost trivial, like as if there is nothing amazing about it, but to change habits is nothing short of miraculous sometimes. To have something other than the thing that really occupies your consciousness most of the time enter, maybe that is one of the definitions of creativity, and for me, I felt like at some point my perspective changed and I looked at myself and I said, well, everything is meaningless, right? So I might as well just start doing things. And I'm going to die in just a few decades, so I might as well try things. And it's amazing how this even happened, because it's really hard to pinpoint the moment where a new thought enters, but new thoughts are necessary for solving problems if your usual thoughts aren't solving them. So we should really get a lot better at that. And now I'm wondering, are there any techniques that are known to you or that you've experimented with actually? So one of them is kind of looking at metaphors, which I think is a creative process, even if you just hear the metaphors other people use, because then you become aware that people can be very different from you, and you can borrow a metaphor from them also, which could help. But I'm wondering, are there any other techniques, like tried and tested techniques, to kind of spark creativity in the domain of emotions?
Yeah, this is I feel like the question so many are after, and many many a book, blog post, Twitter thread have been written, and goes a bit deeper than that. Historically, it's definitely a conversation older than Twitter, probably older than books, but or at least the printing press. I'll say the things that I'm trying to think if there's anything tried and true like that I have encountered or played with. I can't think like I am called to riff on. I have two thoughts in mind that I don't know that I would call them tried and true, but I think that they are interesting points of exploration for like sparking creativity. And like for me, the core of sparking creativity is that like allowing yourself as much space as possible to play around, get messy, and like leave behind right and wrong, good and bad, what will other people think? And those things are really difficult because so much of creativity is constrained within form, right? So if I pick up my guitar and I'm like, I want to write a song, often that'll start with playing chords, right? But like, because chords like on a guitar and an electric guitar versus an acoustic guitar, like it already has a sound like something else, right? So it's like already in this constellation. And so part of, for me, creativity is, like anchoring into what is this that is mine, even if it's like, oh, this is actually coming from that song over there, like letting that be okay. Like, not being like, oh, I need to do something wholly original. And part of that for me is, how do you connect to yourself in a flow state, but not a flow state in the Csikszentmihalyi, like, very, I'm trying not to be too cynical, but like, I feel like a lot of people take the idea of flow state and it's like hyper productivity,
Right, like Kobe Bryant on the, in the zone during a basketball, like this short burst of everything works kind of thing.
Exactly. And for me, this flow is more of like, when you're being creative, how do you tune into like whatever flow you're tuning into in that moment that isn't necessarily right, that like in the zone go, but it's like in writing songs, or like, I'm a pretty bad poet, but my partner, she writes a lot of poetry. So I've been like inspired to write more. And it's just like, how do you just let flow whatever's there, right? And so in terms of tried and true methods, or things to play with, right? The first one tried and true method did come up, and that's like Julia Cameron's morning pages in The Artist's Way. And I think you can do this at any time of day. Like, there is something like, her tried and true method is when you wake up, write for 10 minutes or write out 3, line pieces of paper, right? You can do it timed or you can do it by the amount, and just like every day, and like let your pencil flow or pen flow or fingers on a keyboard flow, and like don't censor yourself. And it's like 5 different things could come up in 10 minutes, and like let them all just like flow as they are. And for her, it's the like, when upon waking, getting into that moment of flow is, and again, like creative flow, not productive flow, is allows you more to see like what even is going on in my mental space, in my heart space, in my creative space, and then letting that be a source of inspiration.
Absolutely. I mean, so much to say there. First of all, I think your framing of flow is a lot more like Stoics, where to them one of the features of living well was euroia, which literally means good flow. So I think a lot of people think a flow state is kind of this modern thing. Well, no, it's ancient, and they aimed at a flow state that's really prolonged, really is kind of follows you around as you go about the day, and not even in conjunction with a certain activity that's for some reason today it's flowing, and but this flow state won't carry over to your next very mundane thing. To them, flow could happen throughout the day, even when you bought your olives at the market, where you were just on top of things and reacting fittingly to things, having the fitting emotion, and then interacting with people, saying the right things to benefit them and yourself. I wish we had talked when I embarked on this journey a year and a half ago and didn't know any of that stuff. But it's also fascinating because now that I am here, like, so much of what you say is something that I've experienced in terms of giving myself the space, being able not to constantly refer to material worries about, if I'm going to create this thing, well, in the end, is it going to make me money? Because I'm kind of worried about money, And this can't be done by declaring war on the thoughts and the worries. You really have to get into a state where you validate both these aspects of yourself that want the best for you, but decide to not to mix them all of a sudden. So much of the processes you just mentioned resonate with me so much. And I just wonder what I would have thought a year and a half ago, because I would probably just be confused. I hadn't done the things, but now that I've gone through a prolonged period of actually trying to find authentic expression and the way to do it, I totally resonate with that. Originality, that's a big thing. I just told you I wrote a short story, and whereas in the past I would pain myself about in some way plagiarizing a story by Edgar Allan Poe, now I have the confidence to know that I was heavily inspired by his story. But, my story is paying an homage to him, and there's a clear allusion in it, and it's not trying to pretend to be something so original that I'm some sort of genius. No, it's his genius, and it's just me, the budding artist who's, in order to find his way, standing on the shoulders of giants. And so that really resonates with me as well. Yeah, creativity, I think, is one of those things that are relatively poorly understood. I think even David Deutsch, who's a physicist and a philosopher I appreciate very much, says that, this is in effect one of those missing links in terms of we really have no idea how to give an AI creativity, for example. Mm-hmm. GPT-3 channeling all these different people, we think it's genius, it's doing something genius. No, actually, it just shows that they were consistent in their creativity, and it kind of finds a new way to reassemble parts and utterances that they said. So creativity is absolutely fascinating. I'm just worried that maybe we've gone off on a tangent here for a while with creativity, which is wonderful. I'm also, while that is true, I'm also wanting to kind of ask you if your story is taking you to any next stop or station on the way in connection with feelings and that whole trajectory of your experiences and thought.
Yeah, so I want to once again, I'll get there, but it was very, very neatly done that you kind of talked to another one of these. This is not a tried and true technique. This is Luke's mad science. This is an interesting way to look at the world technique, which is this first happened to me last year, and it wasn't intentional. It just was one of those things. And this is one of those tricky things about creativity, is sometimes you get hit by something and you're like, oh, that's really interesting, but like it wasn't consciously building in any way, right?
Yeah.
So last fall, I had a day where I had been working with a group of young people in a fellowship that primarily focused on photography, but because of the whole COVID situation, we for the first month and a half had been teaching photography over Zoom. I'm not a photographer. There was another teaching artist. I was the program manager, just to be clear. And we all met up for the first time, and we got to work together, and it was a beautiful day. Like literally it was a beautiful day, but it was also like a really powerful and meaningful day. And after we had that event together, I was in an office that I work out of in West Philadelphia, and I just had this moment of like, imagine your younger self watching your present day as a movie without any context to, if me in 2015 had watched whatever day in November that was, 2020 Luke in this day, right? Or like me at 13 would have watched me at 32 have this day, but no context. No, here's what the journeys were. Here's, just watching it as if in a theater. How would you react? What would you think, right? What would surprise you? What would not surprise you? And for me, that's become a really like an interesting reflective exercise that I'll use sometimes with myself, especially like in moments when still having difficulty, right? And kind of have this like, okay, if me 5 years ago, right? And you mentioned like, 18 months ago, I never would have seen myself here, but now I'm here, right? It's like, if you 18 months ago could be watching this conversation, like as you've started this podcast, but as a movie, not having the like internal linkage from now to then, right? Myself included. Yeah. It like gives interesting insight of, to me at least, like a humble, like appreciation for where I am now that I wouldn't have expected, and that like watching that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my 18-year-old self would probably be so disappointed with me that I'm not a Buddha, that I'm not enlightened, whereas my contemporary self is eager to teach the 18-year-olds. Is like, everybody who has ever claimed to be enlightened is a charlatan. So it's definitely it's definitely striking a chord with me, for sure.
Yeah, no, and similarly, like in going back to that sports example, like if 21-year-old me like saw me on a Sunday, like giving up, like a friend texting me like, hey, I got an extra ticket to the Eagles game, the NFL game, like, do you want to go? And we'd be like, yeah, no, not really interested. Like 21-year-old me would definitely have a retrospective, like in that moment would have a deep existential crisis of 33-year-old me and be like, what the fuck happened? But like for 33-year-old me, that feels fully aligned and like authentic, going back to the word you used. And so for me, like, it's a funny exercise to appreciate the evolution of authenticity, right? And like authenticity to me is not just this perfect form that each of us are moving towards, right? But it's also something that's alive and something that evolves, and what can feel authentic in this moment could feel wholly inauthentic 5 years from now, but that doesn't negate the feeling of authenticity it had in this moment, right? And it's like one of those that to me actually feels like a pretty good example of a dialectic, right? That like your 21-year-old authenticity and your 33-year-old authenticity don't match up, but they both were real and true.
Absolutely, 100%. And luckily I can say for myself that apart from maybe a short period in my teens, but for the most part, I'm very fond of my former self. Like I'm not angry or anything like that. So that's good.
Yeah. I'm I've done a lot of forgiving of myself in the past year, but I'm definitely feeling like, yeah, I've got good relationships with the different pasts that I've lived, somewhere in those 9 lives.
And it's also important. It could be part of our, wish overall to view ourselves as good people, of course. But it's quite cool. Yeah, I know that you worked with young people, and I'm interested in also hearing about some of the trajectories that you've seen them take with some work. So I think the default may be that in our teenage years there's just all this like raging hormones and confusion, but maybe that is something that only happens because our culture doesn't really pay attention to some exercises or things that could facilitate um, better time basically during those years emotionally and in other ways. So yeah, what are some of the effects you've seen on people who have gotten it at an earlier age than us, let's say?
Yeah, so the first thing I have to say is that, so again, I'm 33. I think you're somewhere roughly in the ballpark of that age.
Yeah, I'm 34. I turned 34 in October. Yeah, so
Okay, happy belated birthday.
thank you.
Um, Teenagers now growing up with the internet and digital technology, like we were on the early days, right?
Yeah.
Um, Being a teenager now is at once like so much more opportunity and also like so many more pitfalls to navigate, just because like imagine having an iPhone and a Twitter or Instagram account when you're 15 years old, right? And like in those identity questions of like, who am I? Um, yeah, it's very complex, but I've watched some and like definitely worked with some teenagers, like, and a lot of the work I do is like identity work under the guise of professional exploration for teenagers, right? Oh, you're about to graduate high school, or you're, a young adult who graduated high school a few years ago. You're trying to figure out what to do. Let's look at career exploration. And then really it's like, no, let's look at identity.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I find about teenagers, so for me also, I'll say, and kind of stitching some of this together, and it'll land eventually with the like what comes next. All of us have like a 5, 6 year old, 5, 6, 7 year old version of ourselves, and a like 15, 16, 17, of the way that I've watched teenagers move and the way that I watch adults move and the way that I've watched children move is all, yeah, sure, they're developmental milestones, but the universality there is thick.
Right.
With teenagers, what I find is that when you provide a sounding board and when you really let them explore on their own terms, and I would even say like teenagers and like up to the age of 25, it's not every person by any stretch, but there's some young people who it's like when you provide that space that they can explore things and like be messy, and know that you'll be there regardless, they are some of the most like motivated, uh innovative, reflective people, that it's like they, because of, and like I really do feel this way of like, because of all of the hormonal and developmental and physiological changes that you go through in your teenage years, and like from a brain and mind and conscious perspective, right? That's the moment where like the world kind of does this and you're like, oh, like there was the magical world of a child that then kind of gets dimmed a little, but then you open back up to, and everything's like in 3 dimensions now, or maybe in 4 dimensions now.
Hmm.
And I've worked with young people who go through that realization.
And may I add, it's populated by other people where when you're a child, which adds just complexity beyond measure, as opposed to when you're a little child and people are just kind of two-dimensional to you in a way.
Yep, absolutely. And so yeah, and teenagers come up with profoundly creative ideas. Like I do some like entrepreneurial like intro to entrepreneurship lessons and activities with teenagers. And like, some of them, like there was one student once, and anybody who's listening to this, don't take this idea, at least if you're in Philadelphia. There was a student who had the idea. She was like, I love tattoos and I really like working on cars. And so I want to start a tattoo parlor mechanic shop. And so like, right, you can come and get your car worked on. And while you're getting your car worked on, you can also get some ink. And like, and like we talked about like how you would build a culture around that business of like, they don't all have to be car tattoos, but it's like you can celebrate these two cultures infused,
And call it body paint very clearly.
Oh. There you go.
She hasn't thought of that?
No. We didn't get as far as the name. But yeah, that just being an example, right? And for her, it was like, and this is like the funny thing about teenagers is that like they'll come up with these ideas and they'll just be like, oh yeah, pretty like mundane or like nonchalant about it. Like, oh yeah, I thought that like that makes sense to me. Here's this whole idea that I've created and laid out. And you're like, that's a really smart idea and like really savvy. And yeah, I think you would definitely have a market. And they're just like, cool, like, and it's like, because combining reality and like trying different pieces of reality to see what fits.
Yeah.
Like you in a world that's now populated by more people and things is just a natural state of being. They'll just be like, oh yeah, I made this. And you're like, that's really fucking cool. And they're like, oh yeah, thanks. But having the space to like, and again, this isn't every teenager. Like one thing I've learned is like, everybody is an N of one, like to use academic language for a second, right? But it's like,
right.
you can chart patterns, don't get me wrong, but like you also really appreciate and respect everybody as individual. And so, yeah, that for me are some examples. I think something else that I've watched is like, for certain young people who may have not had certain opportunities and then are provided them, initially there can be a blowback or an overwhelm of like, wow, I never actually thought I'd have this opportunity, but here I am. And then like, once they sink into that, they are a sponge to skills and experimentation. And like, there's a young man in that photography fellowship that like, he always wanted to do photography, never picked up a camera. And then he had got a camera and within like 2 months had taken a few photos. There was one in particular that like multiple people who were in the professional world of photography in Philadelphia were like, yo, I want to buy that print. Like, where is that for sale? And so, and like, he has strong, just natural artistic talent, but also like, as soon as he had this thing in his hands and was like, wow, this really is real, he was unstoppable in a way that I feel like a lot of times adults trying to get into creative endeavors, it's like we have that voice in our head, like what you were saying earlier of like, oh yeah, I really want to do photography, but like, can I do this for money? And like, can I just by putting the time in? It's like when you're young and you like something, it's like those questions haven't infiltrated your psyche yet. You're just like, I love having this camera in my hands, so any spare second that I have, I'm going to let myself be consumed by it. I feel like adults, we have a little bit harder time, like, and this goes back to that play conversation, like allowing ourselves to be consumed by a thing.
Right. Yeah, but I am also worried about where the world is going in terms of, the age, I think, where you're kind of naive in that way is it lasts shorter and shorter amounts of time, I think, because Here's a thought, maybe, of course, school kills creativity. That's the most watched TED Talk, I think, ever. Um, and everybody loves saying it, you know. But do we really know why it kills creativity? Well, supposedly because we sit in classes and maybe not touch enough things or not come in contact with the real world, which, okay, sure. But maybe a big part of it is the fact that, I do believe that people are sending their kids to school thinking that they'll get the kind of education or skill set that will help them navigate through life easier, where this is exactly what kills creativity if you are not given free reign to do these things. So just the fact that there is a schedule and there are expectations, as if why don't we trust young people to find something they're passionate about and just grow into productive people in that domain, is beyond me, right? It's kind of, and it's so archaic to try and telling people, here's the one size fits all solution to how to make a living or something like that. So I think what you're saying is absolutely true, and I'm just truing the fact that it's not more prevalent in our society.
Yeah. I live that life professionally every day, my friend. Um, and I'll give you two pieces of like hopefulness that I feel right now. One being that this is definitely something that is more and more people are like trying to address and come to, right? And I do feel like the pandemic has given a profound opportunity for alternate methods of schooling outside of the like industrial one size fits all model. And I think that's something you've been exploring yourself, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So right now, my daughter is 3, and we have this amazing group of some four between 10 and 14 families that have these gatherings twice a week by a little creek. And, that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. I think people were still in that kindergarten mode where that's where the children go, whatever. And now, even if for some of them, the reason is so prosaic, like we don't want to go into quarantine every 2 weeks. And therefore we should do that, even that. But I think people are coming and it's just picking up momentum. It's just starting. Like now it's seen as completely normal. And at first it was hard for us to find other families to meet with, and now it seems to be ubiquitous. So yeah, I can report that what you say is true.
Yeah. And I think that the other thing that's happening, and again, it's like it's all to play for right now. And by that I mean there are those who definitely want to uphold the rigidity of the industrialized educational model and who are afraid of, and I think that it does come back to like an unresolved fear combined with a like, well, this is the way it was for us, so that's the way it should be, of the sit in a classroom and kind of go through that very life-sucking process. I feel like right now in the working world, right? And there's I'll send you some of these after and you could link them out if you would like. There was I believe he was either Danish or Finnish, thinker, economic philosopher who passed early 2020. His name was Esko Kilpi. And he writes a lot about like the future of work as creative and the systemic changes that we need to get to there. And I think that like thinkers like him, he's one, like you asked about what I want to be doing in the future. I've actually started reading back all of his essays. He had a Medium account, so you can go onto his Medium account and they're all still there. And I've been reading back through them and been thinking about like making a commentary like in honor of his thoughts, and also like connected to our questions here. And he also talks about like in the like emergence of creative labor, the creative economy, what's really important is for people to have internal connection to themselves, right? And not just have, you know, if you're working a labor job or an industry job that pays you well, then like that pay gives you a sense of meaning and value, so that even if you don't love your job, you can go to it, right? And just like, okay, I'm making a good living for my family or for myself, whatever that may mean. And then in the world of creative output, creative labor, etc., that won't suffice for multiple reasons. And so it's like you really need the internal drive, and the development of worldview is one of the things that he talks about, is like in a more creative working world, what is valued is people's unique perspective on reality. And that you can't get there by just like resting your meaning making on, well, I have a good salary and I don't like my job and I'm bored at it, but I can do it and it keeps me like economically stable, if not above, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think, and again, I think it's all to play for. And like me, I definitely tried to be like an optimist realist. Like the optimist part of me is like, everything's laid out for these larger shifts to happen. And the realist in me is like, and there are forces that are trying to have that shift not happen. But I do feel like the thing that you mentioned and brought up about the ruining, right? The example of the student I had who like, he had a camera in his hands and 6 months later he was like making money as a photographer. You know, it's the danger of selling the snake oil, if that can be for everyone. But I do think that there is like the metaphor of the creative tool of the camera for that one young man. There are enough creative tools that if you try different things out and one clicks and then you let yourself be immersed in it, like to me, that is the hopeful way forward. And a little bit of what I'm working with some of the work in Philadelphia with young people is like, how do you give a menu of options and like single serving experiences in podcasting, in photography, in graphic design, etc. And then if a young person is like, oh, I want to do more of that, then it's like a single serving can turn into 3 weeks, and then 3 weeks can turn into 3 months, and like basically build on ramps so that it's not just, oh, you're interested in graphic design, will apply to this 4-year university or this 2-year, you know, associate's program to go get a degree to justify your credentials. Then you can enter the working world. It's like, no, if you have a portfolio and you are a graphic designer who understands the tools, the creative tools, and people appreciate your aesthetic, then a 4-year degree isn't like, it may get you into some rooms, but they're probably not the rooms you want to be in, because you probably want to just be creating. And I think that there are big existential questions around like, what will higher education and college and all of that mean 20 years from now? Hopefully your daughter, right?
Yeah.
Hopefully enough of a viable alternative shows up when she's a teenager and trying to navigate the world, so that we can have these exploratory, you know, platforms and programs that she can come in and she's encouraged to like go try shit out and see what resonates to her. And then part and parcel to that, connect with that as identity making, right? And like have an emotional, a way to like navigate emotions poetically, creatively, so that as she's in the throes of puberty and identity and trying things out, like, you know, the world is there to help her build anchors, not the experience I know I had, and it sounds like you had, where like, yeah, high school was like, here's my limited menu options of identity. None of them really feel right, but I'm at this college preparatory high school, so I guess I'll go with these ones, you know, but definitely felt like a misfit throughout that entire time.
Yeah, that's great. And it reminds me of Spielberg, you know, who dropped out of college, like filmmaking school, but then finally got his degree when I think he handed in E.T. as his master's or something like that, you know, as his thesis. Yeah, absolutely. And I also think it's worth highlighting that experimenting with things and doing even, let's say, 3 months of photography, but then losing your interest in it. Well, that's not a waste of time. And I think that the way the economy would look like in the near future, even, is that and it already is to a certain extent. Like I'm kind of just in some sort of a little bit of contact with the tech world through Twitter. I'm not coming from there, but I already know, that some of the most sought after people are generalists and people with just the curiosity and the interesting story and the willingness to try out new things rather than the specialist who can showcase all the diplomas and the right credentials. Yeah, absolutely. um Being mindful of of your time and of the list of
Yeah.
our listeners' time. I just would like to see if there's any more to be said about where we started in the realm of emotion, if we left anything out there, if there is a way to tie the two, or just generally some ideas that are loose ends right now.
Yeah. So I think first, I appreciate you for letting the conversation meander
It
and
has to
being
be
a
it has to be the kind of podcast that I enjoy doing. So, that's what it is.
yes. No, and the thing that I will try to sum up, because I don't think there's anything more. Um, I guess for anyone who's listening, I encourage you all to explore how you relate to yourself and your emotions in that more poetic way. And like, I think for me, connecting to what we've talked about like the last 15 minutes about school and society, get into these big conversations, that for me, so much of that is grounded again in a knowledge, like in a deeper and a more poetic knowledge of self, and that comes from understanding how do we feel our way through, yeah, our lives and our existence. And I think we had a really powerful example for both of us come up, right, of
Yeah.
that, like, oh well, being in two times at once, but creatively you can go back and look at it and play with it and honor it, right? And that I think for me, we didn't touch on this maybe in a future podcast, but a future episode. Um, I think that grieving is something that people are really afraid of, and I think that we have, like, at an individual level and a mass level, like, if we authentically could hold each other in a grieving process, as we would hold each other through that, the whole world would change, to be a more humane and, like, yeah, authentic existence for all of us. Um, I know that's a big statement.
No, that's beautiful, and I can't wait to explore it honestly, and hear more about it for sure. So you're always welcome to come back for another one. Yeah, I just maybe I want to send the listeners with, what something that I think is very central and connected to what you're saying, is that just remember that emotions, we have the few that we know, and if we're the kind of people that have read many books, maybe the list of kind of defined emotions is grown to, let's say, 40 words if you find all the synonyms and the nuances that are expressed in language. And yet, there are literally an infinite amount of them. So keep an open mind. It's good to anchor them maybe in terms that we have in language, but I really love, and I wish for myself to really adopt this habit of also characterizing them by metaphors and, of course, self-expression, as we said. So I think that sums up nicely, uh, what we can do here, maybe.
Yeah, well, thank you again so much for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
I'm so happy that it finally worked for me. I think you're officially the guest I've had to woo for the longest period of time. So really happy to do it. Really happy to do any future ones you'd like to do. And thank you so much, Luke.
All right. Have a wonderful rest of the day.